So welcome back. I'm delighted to see that at least some of you decided to stay back for this last closing panel, and I can promise you that it's going to be exciting, thought-provoking, and you will love to hear from the speakers that we have lined up for the closing panel. So let me get us started. So the topic of the closing panel is open source SDN NFV ready for prime time? Are you? So I guess, as you know, when I opened Open Networking Summit, 3 days ago, I made the observation that open source SDN and NFV are inevitable, and they are here and they are ready for prime time. And what I meant by that at the time is that they are ready for vendors, service providers and so on to take open source and start building real products, real solutions, and then get them deployed. I hope that in whatever the last 3 days that you participated in Open Networking Summit, you have either come to the same conclusion or you have gotten enough insight that you can engage in a debate about where we are with open source SDN and NFV, what do we need to do, what types of business models we need to invent in order to make that successful. And so we will start out by listening to our distinguished panelists about their thoughts about where we are, what the challenges are, and what do we need to do. And then we have enough time reserved at the end that we should be able to have the conversation with you as well. So please think about your own assessment. What do you see are the challenges? What needs to happen? So we can have a nice dialogue about this topic. Okay, so I think let me introduce our panelist. So the first person is Dan Pitt, who is the Executive Director of Open Networking Foundation. So Dan, okay, here he is. Let's welcome Dan. So in many ways, Dan and I are colleagues. We sit in the same office on the days that I am at Open Networking Lab. We are part of, our mission is very similar to make open source, open SDN happen. And I must admit that Dan, I would like to characterize as the biggest champion, biggest evangelist for open SDN, and is very passionate about it. Anytime he sees any signs of closed SDN, he gets very upset, and he gives me his fair share of hard time if I am kind of deviating from that path. Okay, so it's great to have Dan on this panel as well. Our next panelist is Chris Luke from Comcast. Chris, please. Welcome, Chris. So I must admit that I have not interacted with Chris before. I'm just getting to know Chris, but I'm gotten to know his work. He is working at Comcast, which is one of the service providers, and relatively you would expect to be conservative. So he is the troublemaker. He is wanting Comcast to transform and embrace SDN, embrace open source SDN, and so delighted to have Chris here. Okay. Next panelist is Arpit Joshipura. So welcome, Arpit. So I've gotten to know Arpit well in last few months as I have been planning this particular Open Networking Summit. I bounced a lot of ideas with Arpit, and he has provided a lot of good insights about how to think about ONS, how to think about Open Networking Summit. But more importantly, Arpit is one of the champions of kind of transforming a vendor into embracing open networking and open source networking, and I'm looking forward to hearing his insights as well. So our next panelist is John Ronis from Lightspeed Ventures. Welcome, John. So John has been part of kind of the ONS family for last few years, and I really appreciate that. He has been co-chairing the hot startups and the VC track for last couple of years, and really appreciate that. And more importantly, John has been one of the most active investors in the SDN space. He has, and he had some successes in the SDN space as well. And so he has very interesting perspective on SDN as well as open source and how entrepreneurs can benefit from open source and SDN. So look forward to his presentations as well and thoughts. Last but not the least, Neila Jacques from Linux Foundation and ODL. Welcome, Neila. So Neila is again, you can call him fellow traveler. He is another person who is very, very passionate about open source and has been championing open source, ODL, very, very effectively. And it is great to have Neila part of the open source community and open source SDN, very effective leader. And for last whatever year or more, he has been executive director of ODL and has developed a lot of good insights about SDN, open source SDN. And so look forward to having your insights as well. So without any further ado, I think Dan is going to start and share his thoughts first. So everybody is going to talk for maybe 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will have an open conversation. Okay, Dan?
Thank you, Guru. Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for staying so long. And I hope you find this final panel rewarding. We're going to give our final sort of conclusions and positioning on where we really stand in this. And typically, I think we're all striving for a lot of the same outcomes, but we're employing different means because we represent different really kind of segments and approaches to the industry. So I'll tell you a little bit about ONF and open source. And it's been a journey for us. It's an important part of our portfolio. And as I've said, we're really on a path from PDF to Python. And so when we look at open source, we've tried to articulate the principles that kind of govern our approach to this topic. And the first principle we abide by, of course, is that it's got to be in fulfillment of our mission. And our mission has been the same. I put it on slides for years now, to accelerate the adoption of open SDN. By adoption, we really mean services based on it and products that enable it. So that's why we embrace both the operators and the vendors to bring them together and find solutions that really make a difference in the marketplace. Now, in our own investments in open source, to complement the other things we do, we have a particular objective in mind. And the reason we're adding Python to PDF is to deliver artifacts that are more consumable really by the community, operators in particular, but also the vendors who want to build products based on this. We've been accused of producing things you can't eat, and you can't eat atmosphere in a restaurant, and you can't eat PDF in an operator's network. But you can consume and deploy and learn from an experience technologies delivered as software and code. Another principle of ours is we are not going to duplicate anybody else's efforts. And you see a lot of main contributors to the whole ecosystem on the stage here, and others of you sitting here in the audience. Major projects, some smaller projects. Everyone is doing good work. There is more work to do than there are people to do it. The last thing we would want to do is to duplicate what somebody else has done. So you'll see, in fact, that what we are doing is embracing and adopting what other people have done to try to build a sentient whole out of the different pieces. And we are working closely with the other groups, and it's a pleasure to do that. It's really an honorable fraternity here, and not fraternity as opposed to sorority, because we also work with Heather Kirksey at OPNFV. And another aspect of what we're trying to do is to encourage developers of all sizes, which means not just the big corporations, but also the individual sorts of garage entrepreneurs. And you'll see that in our repository that we've opened up, our portal, we're really going to encourage people to attack the long tail of user needs that are not met by only the mainstream efforts. So we have been learning for a couple of years what to do with open source, and we've learned sort of in a painful way. We've made some investments. They haven't necessarily paid off in the way we thought they might, but they have paid off in teaching us what we need to know about open source. So we launched a driver competition. This is a stub to go into an open source controller. We had a dozen great entries, and we picked a winner. We gave a check at the Open Networking Summit a year ago for $50,000, one of these big cardboard checks, to CPQD of Brazil. Everyone promptly left CPQD and went to other things. And it went into our repository, and it kind of sat there. And people are occasionally downloading and doing stuff. We get feedback on it from time to time. It hasn't become mainstream. We learned that. We commissioned an application called Sample Tap, which allows you to use OpenFlow just to tap off flows and analyze them. It doesn't change how you do routing and switching. And so it was sort of an easy learning tool. We got some good feedback on that. We formed a software leadership council. You can see the names on our website. We're a bunch of sort of networking protocol people, and we thought we should learn from the experts. So we pulled together a lot of people from our organization and Star from outside to help give us guidance on how you do something like this, and in particular, how to build community. We hired Saurav Das last year to develop a segment routing code segment that went into ONS to allow you to use OpenFlow to distribute the labels at the beginning of an MPLS chain and not have to use MPLS TE. This was sort of on request from some of our operator members. Help us get there from here. We have a big brownfield instance, and let's start small. We developed a northbound interface framework based on intent. Became an ODL project. It's turning into code, and we're doing more with that, which I'll tell you about. And we put together a portal called opensource.sdn.org. You can see a lot of the details I'll tell you about there. And then we launched Atrium this week. And the goal of Atrium really is to solve three problems. One is we have a bunch of these wonderful components, but how do you build a system out of them without trying to build your own PC? The other problem was we've got applications that are not portable across OpenFlow switches. And the third problem is that the switches themselves are not interoperable, and especially beyond OpenFlow 1.0. So we developed solutions to these to give kind of a composite answer to the question of how do I get my hands on this system and learn from it quickly. I showed this slide on Tuesday morning rather, of what Atrium is. It's a distribution, it's a vertical slice. It incorporates an application, a control plane, and a forwarding plane connected by OpenFlow 1.3. You could see that it was actually running in the solutions showcase with 7 forwarding planes, different pipelines, different operating systems, but all interoperable through these 2 devices of having them write their own plugin and this thing we call the Flow Objectives interface inside of ONS. And this has been kind of a breakthrough for us to get a lot of interoperable hardware OpenFlow switches and to have a distribution. It's narrow. It's just this one little application. It will grow. It is a framework. We're investing, and the community is investing in it as well. In addition to Atrium, we have a few other projects underway in opensource.sdn.org, which is not an organization, just a portal. You see them here. We got a real-time media interface specification. This we've done with the Microsoft drove it, and the Unified Communications Interoperability Forum has been a partner in that as well. The Intent NBI, which we've actually done in a way now that is making it kind of independent of the controller. So we have an open intent engine, runtimes for ONS and ODL. One is completed, the other will be completed this summer. And hopefully that will be a model of how to make applications portable across controllers as well as across forwarding planes. These others you can see, we actually have made some progress in security with an assessment tool. We think that's a good place to learn from. In addition, we've got a project on orchestration and automation really motivated by financial services enterprises that are more concerned with that than they are with the plumbing and the forwarding plane. End-to-end WAN as a service, again, from the telecom world. We've already had some code drops there, coming at the end of the month, a good one. Protocol-independent forwarding. This is where we're focusing on an open source intermediate representation of a language that you can use to program the pipeline to tell it what to do instead of having the switch tell the controller in the application what it can do. And then finally, we're just announcing today an OpenFlow, sort of a flight data recorder project. This is like the black box in an airplane. It can capture all the flow information, be used for analysis and traffic engineering. So some of the things that we think of to keep in mind when we're embedding open source into our portfolio, along with the other things that we do, are these. Where does it make sense? And we think it makes sense in a lot of places, but not everywhere. And in fact, if you want to really foster innovation in the vendor community, you have to choose very carefully where you do open source and only put it where you do not need vendor differentiation. That should free up resources to where vendor differentiation makes a difference to the customers. We also believe that a little architecture helps. We do a lot of architecture, some specifications that helps to inform the code that we do and that we contribute and that we encourage other people to do. So it's part of a larger picture of having good network architecture. Certainly, it's no surprise. We have a lot of projects. What do you do with all these projects? Number one, you collaborate. We are pleased to be working with just about everybody here on stage and some of the other projects we have mentioned. We convened a roundtable with 6 projects here to make sure we don't step on their toes, they don't step on our toes, keep them informed of what we're all doing. We're all serving a very important common end, and we have to work together on this. And finally, as we learned, kind of the hard way, and other people already know, you can't really succeed in this without building community. It's really the community that gives you the good technical solutions, that validates customer requirements, gives you rapid feedback, and makes it fun. So my conclusion is this. We know that the operator market, as we heard this week, they want solutions. They want integrated solutions to their problems. They want to build best-of-breed networks with the technology of choice for their particular needs. They understand the benefits of SDN plus NFV plus open source. They want to know how to operationalize it. How do they incorporate it into their operations, into their cultures, into their processes? And we want to help them do that. So ONF is always here to help to accelerate the adoption of OpenSDN. We started the portal. We hope that'll be useful in bringing new solutions to the availability of everyone. Atrium is our big launch this year. We will build out on that with a lot of friends. And we are really grateful for the community that we are already benefiting from, our partners and the other organizations, our own members, the community at large, and individual contributors as well. So go look at the website, opensourcesdn.org. Let us know what you think, contribute your ideas, and help us accelerate the adoption of OpenSDN. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, handy little crib sheet. So, the first thing I want to say is I'm really glad I saw as many women in our community this conference, but I'm hoping we can do better next year. We need more women in our community. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Let's talk about why I like using open source in my network. And a key one, which we've heard repeated several times this conference, is the word lock-in. And as Neila was reminding me earlier, there's 2 kinds of lock-in. There's good lock-in, where there's functionality that you want, and it's not too hard to remove, but it does something that you value, and you can carry on valuing it. But there's also the bad kind of lock-in, where something you've put in your service, in your network, in your company, is so difficult, so painful, and so expensive to extract when you want to change it, that you end up not doing it. And that's bad, and that's, in my opinion, evil. Open source helps you get away from that, especially if you participate in that community. The idea is that if enough people get together and can come to some kind of consensus about the way forward, you can also bring your ideas to that same table so that you don't feel locked in. So, it should be pretty simple. What I will say is that in my experience, the service provider community, which is what I'm trying to share the experience of here, have been beginning to protest about this increasingly loudly. So, first thing I'll say about this picture is if you do not recognize this feather, please leave your geek card on the door on the way out. The Apache project has been one of the most successful open source foundations since the internet was commercialized.
Just about everybody in this room will have seen a web page served by the Apache HTTPD. It has been around since the early 90s. In the early days, it was internet service providers that were hosting web servers and contributing that code back to the community. I would say that in the 10, 15 years since that, it has perhaps waned a bit because other services have become more popular, Google's and Facebook's and so on. The internet service provider has moved more to the edge of the value chain, which is fine. But what I see now is that some of that view is changing, and things like SDN and NFV are a large part of the reason for that. So, when OpenFlow was young, we had some SDN controllers. SDN controllers then were reference code written in C or maybe C++, which did some very simple things to prove the concept. Layer 2 learning switch, check, we can do that. Fantastic. Then some researchers came up with the projects Nox and Pox, which is great. They were fantastic code bases. I've played a lot with Pox myself to show some of the concepts to my fellow engineers that we can do with things like OpenFlow. But they're not controllers. They're not general purpose platforms unless your purpose is to write code. And that doesn't build a service. So all of this was quickly followed by a number of proprietary commercial offerings. We've heard of things like Contrail and all the stuff that the other vendors have done as well, but they have varying focus. They always focused on specific problems that they were trying to build a product around rather than being fully general purpose. And of course, we had some other open source work, things like RYU, which is still around today. We heard the NSA guy this morning saying that they use it in their network, which is great. So, talking about controllers, what is the role of the SDN controller in the network? Well, for me, it's pretty simple. I want a uniform, abstract interface for interacting with the network. It's great, but what does that really mean? And I have to go back to the lasagna analogy earlier. I want layers of stuff. But the key with lasagna in a network is you need to understand who owns each layer. Otherwise, people will start arguing about what they have to do on that. So, we had this abstract interface. The problem is unless you standardize on some kind of interface, and I am the first person to hate any kind of committee-based work, you end up with lots of people doing their own thing. None of them look the same. The euphemism for lock-in is vertical integration. And lots of the products we've seen in the marketplace have ended up being vertically integrated stacks of stuff. And in some cases, our vendor friends ignored the issue altogether. So, then Open Daylight happened, and later ONS as well. And these changed things radically. They brought together a huge amount of community, initially vendors, but still community, that said, we want to do something better. Open Daylight, for instance, has the strap line. We want a common platform for doing these things. And I believe they're well on the way to doing so. I think ONS, which has a slightly different focus in the network, is doing similar work. The net result is that those proprietary offerings that I was telling you about, that were all bifurcated and different and I didn't touch at all, have all but died. You don't hear about them so much anymore. A few of them pop up now and then, but they're still their relatively closed environments. They don't necessarily integrate well. They have their own northbound. So, the other thing that has changed relatively recently is that many of the vendors who are supporting the projects like Open Daylight and ONS are offering to support bundled versions of it. And they're starting to steer away from bundled versions with their own secret source bundled in with it. I'm very pleased to hear that. I've also heard tell of a couple of vendors who are willing to support the vanilla stuff that you can download direct from the Open Daylight and ONS websites, which is just fantastic. So, I'm here to talk about NFV. What does this story tell us about NFV? So, you could say that NFV covers a much broader area of technology. And there's been some work with Etsy to define a framework because we needed to agree on something. That's fine, and they're now off working on some of the interfaces for that. But until that's delivered, we end up with lots of vendors trying to sell products under the NFV moniker, and we have the same thing that we had with controllers happening. They're all doing their own thing. They're completely incompatible with each other. They have different northbounds. So, even when they use OpenStack, some of them have their own vSwitch on the hypervisor. And for me, that has the smell of lock-in. The other thing is that the network functions themselves don't have a common interface with how they get orchestrated. We have this concept of ecosystems of stuff. Everyone has their own SDN app store, and I can't take apps from there and put them over here. We've heard this before in other industries. But for this, it's a problem, because if I want to use my favorite vendor's firewall VNF over here, but I'm using this platform over here, and they haven't certified, I'm basically screwed. There's nothing I can do about it other than hope. I don't like that. So, where does this lead? Well, I think that we have come to the point where we've got enough open source projects in the wild that have communities for NFV where some of these activities are going to begin to converge. That means there's going to be some rationalization between these projects, I'm sure, because they overlap in some places, but we're at a promising crossing point in the development of these projects. So, and with that code being open, hopefully, the avenues for lock-in should be avoided. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some open source at Comcast. And the project that we like to talk about a lot is OpenStack, because we have quite a large group that are focused on it. A few years ago, we decided to focus on OpenStack as a way of delivering cloud-like services internally. Only tenants are internal. And all the guys in blue shirts are my colleagues in the cloud group, mostly based in Reston. One of these does not look like the others. Spot the network engineer. That's actually my boss. So at the last OpenStack conference in Vancouver about a month ago, for some reason they awarded us the Super User Award because of the amount of work we've done with OpenStack, the amount of code, the amount of documentation and evangelization we've contributed back to the community. Not least, some of that work includes a significant base of code to make IP version 6 work in OpenStack, which is a key strategic requirement for our company. So, let's bring this back to what we're talking about here. A while ago, I did a blog post for Open Daylight in my role as an advisory group member, and we announced that we, Comcast, joined Open Daylight as sponsoring members. Why did we do that? Well, increasingly, we've been using this project in our network, and as part of our commitment to contribute to open source projects, we felt it was time and necessary for us to support this project publicly. In the blog post that I did, I talked about some of the things that we are trying to do with Open Daylight. One of the simple ones will resonate true to this audience, I hope, around the role of virtualizing the edge of our network for both residential and for our commercial products. We are looking at how we can effectively reduce the cost of that CPU we put on a customer premise, but increase the speed at which we provision services and increase the speed at which we develop new services. So, participation in open source projects. As I said at the start, service providers' support for open source projects has waned over the last 10, 15 years, but I see it now coming back up. We see open source as the mechanism to accelerate, hence the nice flashy colors, our ability to deliver new services quicker, faster, better, more, all the same stuff. We use OpenStack to host our flagship X1 platform, or at least major portions of it, and we make that's completely open and public knowledge. We trust it enough with our services that we will put something that our 22 million plus subscribers look at every day on that platform. But open source needs a community to be successful, and that's the key. That is why service providers, who are the customers of many of these open source projects, need to get involved. There is no doubt. And as somebody else has said earlier in this conference, you always get more out of open source than you put in. You don't need to put that much in to get a lot out of it. So, my final slide. What does it take to get involved? It's pretty simple, not much. At the very least, join a mailing list and see what's going on and contribute some input. Think, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. How about this instead? If you're wrong, people will let you know, but you'll soon learn how that community works. Any level of support is enough to help build a community. If enough service providers all added their support to some of these projects, I do not think this would be the challenge it is today. So, keep calm and contribute code.
All right, so being the only vendor on the panel, right? It's kind of, between between customers and by design. All right, so when Guru asked me to do this closing panel, the first thought came in my mind, which is, what if this was 5 years ago, right? Then we would have probably 2 vendors, right? And the only open and interoperable thing we would be talking about would be the WDM, CWDM layer and the Ethernet, right? They interoperate, check. Everything else, don't even bother, right? And look at where we are today. We are 5 years into this journey on networking, and we have some of the most innovative and disruptive technology that is not just being created by vendors, but by open source, open standards, and the community. All for consumption of enterprises and carriers. So really excited to be here. I'm going to cover 3 things, and it'll be very quick and simple. The first one is about timing. Since this is more of a business models and things like that, it's always good to talk about when is the crossover going to happen. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the architecture that this creates, both SDN and NFV, and how we're moving to a compute-centric environment and how similar it looks. And the last message I'd leave you with is the whole concept of open washing. So bear with me while I go through these 3. All right, very busy chart. Let me explain each line in gory detail, okay? We've all seen technology adoptions, okay? These are all technology adoptions. The one on the right is closer to where we are. I was not even born on the left-hand side. That's the Great Depression, okay? Point being, technology is getting adopted much faster, and there's a lot faster technologies that are coming out. Let me bring it to home. The curve on the left upper side is actually the enterprise technology adoption. The blue line, the start of the blue line is 1995, okay? Dell launched its first PowerEdge x86 server. Mainframes had 100% market share. In 10 years, okay, 2005, the crossover happened. More than 50% of the market was open and disaggregated, okay? When you look at it today, you don't even think about these things, okay? Now, the next technology that is based on similar concepts moves much faster. This is again, I read through every technology adoption in the previous slide, and I came to this simple conclusion. So I didn't want to bore you with all that details. But the next technology adoption is 5 to 8 years, okay? The same thing on the right-hand side, which is on the carrier. We've been through this: packet, circuit, mobile, broadband, fixed broadband, okay? Same concept. The second one is faster than the first one. So why should open networking be any different? Okay? Just like compute got disaggregated and became open, we're already on the way there to get more than half of the systems out there that are open. Okay? And we expect by 2020 it would cross over. Now, some very aggressive carriers like AT&T are saying, it's much faster, it's much more, like 70%, but this is the general market, okay? And we are really excited because, this is what Dell has done for the server market, and we're all set to do for the networking market, okay? So what are we talking about here? We've heard enough technical tracks and enough details on the SDN and the NFV. So what is open networking? How do I put it all together? And we have a very simple view of that. At its roots, what open networking is it's a disaggregation of networking technologies that gives you maximum capability and maximum choice, as Chris mentioned, right? I don't want vendor lock-in. I just want choice. So what are you disaggregating, okay? You're disaggregating the hardware from the software. You're disaggregating physical networking from virtual networking. You're disaggregating control plane from forwarding plane. OpenFlow and SDN started on the right-hand side, but very quickly we have caught up and we have covered the entire spectrum of disaggregation, right? The whole phenomena of white box, right? And Gartner calls us bright box, which is really the branded white box, which we fall into that category, right? Being, support and services, which is, again, the value add from a vendor perspective, is a fundamental disruption that has really, really, changed the way networks will get built. Now, what are we doing from an open source and an open standards perspective? I want to highlight that since that's the theme of this. We've gone in and so we announced this at OCP last year, right? And since then, a lot of members have followed, a lot of vendors and competitors have followed through. The other thing we have done is we have brought the community together to define what is called the SI layer, or the switch abstraction interface layer. So imagine that you're writing your applications on the switch or outside the switch, and you don't have to worry about the silicon that goes in the switch, right? Dan brought it up, right? This switch doesn't operate with that switch. Well, imagine if it's abstracted. That's the SI layer, right? Whether it's a Broadcom or a Mellanox or an Intel or a Cavium, chipset, abstract the chipset, abstract the platform. All of those things that, really make it hard for a vendor to move or a customer to move over, we're going to drive that in the community. Okay, very significant piece of disaggregation. And then on the overlay side, we all know, there's the stacks, right? There's the Microsofts and the VMwares and the OpenStacks and the container-based networking. All of them, from an enterprise perspective, will start developing and will hopefully bring it down to enough of interfaces that can interoperate, right? And we've already talked about the OpenFlow and the SDN part of it. So the key here is, with disaggregation of networking, right, you get to an impact that is beyond networking, okay? It's not just the networking stack. You have a software-defined enterprise on the left, and you have a software-defined carrier on the right. Networking, as you can see, is just one small piece of the puzzle. A big piece, okay, we are in networking, a big piece of the puzzle. But there's servers, there's storage, there's the standard-based hardware, right? We talked about the lasagna model, right? Today it's the hot dog model, right? Vertically integrated stack. You want to get to lasagna, and I know it's dinner time for a lot of you, but couldn't resist. You need a choice of, open stack. You need a choice of virtualization layer. You need a choice of hardware, and you need a choice of applications then run on it. Whether it's the workloads on the left, SAP, Oracle, etc., or it's the VNFs on the right. The exact same compute-centric architectures are what we want to get to. And the good news is, we're there. Conceptually, we are there. Product-wise, we are there. Now it's the deployments and the adoption, right? The only difference I'll point out is carriers are a little bit more strict on standardization of the MANO layer. Versus on the left-hand side, on the enterprise, every vendor puts stuff together and say, I got it, right? There is no northbound OSS BSS that we have to worry about, okay? But on the right-hand side, it's much stricter, okay? So with that, the last statement that I want to make is determine your appetite for open, okay? This is a very important slide, okay? I don't want people to sort of get an impression that open is the new proprietary, okay? Because there are degrees of openness. And we will discuss and debate this as a panel. But on the left, you have the walled garden. Your infrastructure, your system software, your control plane, your applications and services are completely provided by one vendor. The only thing that interoperates, as I said, is light and electrical signals, Ethernet and WDM. That's it, okay? Or Sonnet in some instances. We have moved from there, hopefully, some of the vendors have moved from there to what we call the vendor-enhanced ecosystem. What this provides is you got the infrastructure that can be sort of mix and matched, but the system software, the control plane apps still come from a single entity. It's a vertical lock-in, right? And I've heard carriers tell me a lot of times saying, hey, I used to buy this black box from 5 vendors. Now NFV allows me to buy it from a different vendor. It's still locked in. It just happens to be on an x86. What's the point, right? And that's not what we want to do, right? We want to move to the right, where now you can start seeing the best of breed ecosystems, right? Where you have a choice of the OpenStack, you have a choice of Linux distribution, you have a choice of controllers, you have a choice of the silicon that goes inside the switch, all defined by standard interfaces and open source software, right? The only thing that is tied up in the third degree of openness is the control plane and the apps, primarily because of what we just mentioned, which is the northbound interface, okay? The nirvana is actually the right, which is open source and open standards based ecosystem. And we are here to sort of push the entire industry in that direction, because that is what drives innovation. 20 years ago, when servers and x86 were created, nobody knew what a load balancer is. You put load balancer software on a server, all of a sudden the server was called a load balancer, okay? I want networking and switching to do the same thing. The switch should take the personality of the software you load on it, okay? And that you can only do if you are decoupling and disaggregating at the standards and the interface level, okay? So keep an eye on this, right? Do not make the mistake of, calling open the new proprietary, because marketing will come out and say that, okay? So you got to be careful. So that's what I have, and I'm going to now, hand it over to John, who's a VC, so he's got a more expensive suit than me.
Thanks, Arpit. I think my wife bought this jacket. I wear it once a year for things like this, but I don't have as pretty as slides, so you're going to have to pay attention more to what I say. So Guru asked me this year to talk a little bit about the venture capitalist perspective on what's happening in the startup ecosystem and networking in general. I've been a general partner at Lightspeed going on 10 years now, and have made a number of investments in the space, starting with Nicira once upon a time, and now am intimately involved with things like Barefoot Networks and Avi Networks and Plexi and a few other companies. So Guru, if you don't mind, I'm going to play professor for a second. Sure, please. And I thought what would be helpful is to give people some context on the VC industry today, but to do that, you really need to start with a little bit of history. And so if you actually look at the VC industry, it started in the late 60s based on funding from the government on technologies that would help us in the skirmishes we got into. And now is a highly advanced industry here 40 years later. You can actually look at the number of firms that are active over the course of the last few decades. And what's interesting is if you study the industry, the vanguard firms of any decade actually all follow a similar formula. And so the formula is comprised of really three things. The first part is what I like to call the artists. It's those visionaries that kind of see the world in a way that the rest of us mere mortals can't. They see the masterpiece in the block of clay and kind of where things are going. The second piece is most startups that are successful began because that visionary saw an inflection in technology, some disruption in the force, if you will, and an opportunity to leverage that and disrupt the incumbent products or solutions that were out there. And when you marry the two things, those artists with those key inflections in history, kind of to Arpit's graph, although not as pretty, you get these massive disruptions, these massive changes. And as a result, you get value creation. You see billion dollar plus companies created. And they're unique, but when they happen, there's usually more than one company that's created that rides that wave. And so, interesting slide from bankers. Any bankers in the room? Anyone ever started a company in this room? Raise your hand. Awesome. Okay. Well, if you look kind of to Arpit's point, at every layer of IT, just in the last few years, you see massive disruption. On the left, you have incumbent technologies in everything from ERP to CRM to security to systems management to storage. And on the right, you see all these companies that didn't exist a decade ago. And they've created literally tens of billions of dollars in value and jobs for people, right? No, networking isn't on this slide. So the question is, are there any disruptive themes now? Right? You asked me as a VC, what do we talk about? What's going on in 2015? Some of you may have seen this Fortune article. There's a lot of talk about dragons and unicorns and billion-dollar companies being created. This is just a representation of, just in the last 2 years, how many private companies are worth north of $1 billion. I think the latest count is we're over 130. Before a couple years ago, there had been 3 in history. So maybe that's data that there's a bubble going on. But it also might be that people's lives are changing as a result of these disruptive technologies. The way you pay for things, the way you get from point A to point B, the way you communicate with people, the way you book where you stay when you come on these trips. It's all different than it was 5 years ago. I think someday someone will write a book and they will talk about the way we live now, the way they talk about Rome. It's changing that much. So I stole this slide from the hot startup section because it's better than I can create with my PowerPoint skills. But it came from one of the networking leads at Docker. Anybody know Docker? If you don't, you better. It's going to change the way infrastructure is being done. But the point of the slide was, why disruption? Well, the way applications are built today are very different than just a few years ago. You hear all about this term, microservices. Why? Well, the web pages most of you are on now, I can see you. It's kind of bright, but I can see you. But they're comprised of services, sometimes hundreds, thousands of services. Any Netflix users? Lots of services in that app. And so services do a lot of things. They allow people to move faster, to break apart that innovation chain. And that is the way we are going. And as a result, all of the pieces of infrastructure that support that, they're changing too. And so it's not just the apps and how they're created, it's where they run and how they're managed. And so from the venture capitalist point of view, I talked about inflections in technology that create impact. Boy, we're living through an amazing period of inflective technology. Microservices, cloud, smartphones, containers. It's changing everything. So what about networking? Yeah, actually, and I put, I think, over $100 million in startups to support the thesis. So I'm either crazy or hopefully right. But in the startup panel, we try to create a representation of the ecosystem and to demonstrate that from everything to network management, to the network services, to the switches themselves, to the operating systems, and even the silicon, there are startups hard at work innovating, breaking the stranglehold that the incumbents have had on the networking ecosystem for the last couple decades. And they can't do it alone. I think someone mentioned timing. Startups win when there's a tailwind, when there's a massive tailwind, because they always make lots of mistakes. I like to say you can build a shiny boat. You can have the smartest team in the world. If there's no wind, that boat's not going anywhere. But if there's a lot of wind, you can have a dinghy, and that thing can really get moving. Well, we're in the middle of a tornado, is what I'm trying to communicate. And open source is at the heart of it. So the key question is, okay, why is open source so powerful? So let me go back to professor mode for a second, right? Most startups fail. They're hard. Literally in a venture capitalist portfolio, maybe 50 companies, it's 2, sometimes 3 that matter. They generate 99.9% of the gains. The other 47, maybe you get your money back, maybe you get nothing at all. Well, why is that? Well, startups have 2 fundamental problems. They have to find product market fit. Steve Blank likes to call it the value hypothesis. You have to build a product that people like and recommend. And the second problem startups have is they need to figure out how to scale with an economically viable business model. Honestly, everyone, 90% of startups never get past A, finding product market fit. And sadly, most startups try to do both, find product market fit and an economically viable business model at the same time. It's why most entrepreneurs fail. You've got to build something that people love and recommend. Only desperate people buy from startups. Otherwise, they would buy the incumbent product. So you've got to find those people who are desperate for what you're building. You started a company because you had an insight. You believed the world needed what you're building. Now you got to find those people who are desperate for it. If you can't find any, well, you were wrong. But I'm telling you, in networking, there's a lot of pain and there's a lot of desperation. Now, the second part about an economically viable business model, that's about scaling. And if you look over the last 20 or 30 years of venture, people funded companies this way. Come in, here's 10 slides, here's my idea. Okay, if it's an enterprise kind of business, here's $5 to $12 million. Go develop for a year or two in your office or your garage. Come back, let's see if you found product market fit. If you did, the few that did, okay, here's another forklift of millions of dollars. Now let's go sell it. Let's go evangelize to the CIOs and the VPs of the world why you were right and why they should use this thing every day. That's how it's worked. But then open source came along. Open source, if you think about it, if you really think about it, if you just remember anything I tell you today, remember this. Open source, you get product market fit for free. By definition, if you have a community, you have people who like and recommend the product. It's incredibly powerful. But it only works in a networking kind of way when you have that community. Without a community, you've got nothing. And then the other aha moment, maybe you have to noodle this, but it's part B. How do you scale a company? I don't have to evangelize anything. It's grassroots. I like to call it preaching to the converted. I show up and I say, you should really use this product. Why? Well, you already are. That's the power of open source. And for those of you who want to be entrepreneurs, when you raise money, you get diluted. There's only 100% of the business that you can own, right? You raise a lot less money in open source companies because you don't need that expensive evangelical sales force. Yes, you may invest a little more in R&D in the beginning, but in the long run, you win and you win big. And so that's starting to happen in networking. It's starting to happen because all the other pieces of this ecosystem have been disrupted. It started with decoupling hardware from software. Thank you, VMware and Nicira. And now we're seeing it with operating systems, the network services, P4. If you don't know what P4 is, go figure it out. It's going to be important. These things are changing the same way they did in compute and storage and big data. Anyone heard of Red Hat? Cloud era? I mean, guys, that's what's going to happen in networking. Now, the stranglehold is tight by that company with a C. But it's changing. It's changing. So, question is, do you believe? Not that kind of belief, but anyway, that's all I had to say. Thanks.
Wow.
All right, well, I'm your last speaker. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Neila Jacques. I'm the Executive Director of Open Daylight. And the one thing I'm not going to tell you about in this presentation is actually Open Daylight. Because in fact, Guru asked me to talk to you a little bit about a word that Arpit brought up, which is open washing. And I have to tell you, I know a little bit about this because I keep getting this question, which is, hey, you run an open source project, but there are a whole bunch of vendors in your project. Vendor, open, what gives? So let's start by putting these two gentlemen up on a slide. Because I think the debate in some people's minds still hasn't shifted from the 1990s. And so there are probably some of you who, when you think open source, think Richard Stallman versus Bill Gates. And there's a wonderful argument here that's still somewhat alive, which is on one hand, you've got a group of people who say open source is religion. Freedom is a fundamental right of everybody in this world. And if you show up with an iPhone in my office, I'm going to throw it against the wall until it explodes because it is evil. On the other hand, there's another group of folks who will say, you know what, we're all sitting here because someone pays our salary. If you want great innovation, you got to have great engineers, and great engineers need to eat. And so if we want innovation, open source is just going to kill innovation. We're going to drive the profits out of everything. Well, here's what's kind of interesting. Where's the innovation in this world? Well, if we look at the last few years, where's the majority of the innovation that has come in the storage of data? Has it come from Oracle? Has it come from IBM? Or has it come from MySQL, or maybe even Hadoop? You know, if you think about operating system, when a gentleman goes out to the beach and thinks to himself, wow, it'd be really neat to put a little camera on the front of my surfboard, just watch me surfing the waves. Does he go out and go up to Redmond and sign a big deal? Or does he go find a penguin who's willing to sit inside that little camera of his? And as we think about this move to cloud computing, OpenStack, a wide group of people coming together, this is where the innovation has been. Now, is that to say that there's no innovation in large companies? Well, obviously not. However, it has gotten a lot more challenging. And it's interesting, you know, I'm a huge fan of this man, Satya Nadella. But I don't know that I would want his job, because he has a big, big job. And if you think about what he's had to do over the last few years, he has had to admit to himself, to his company, and to the world that they can't be the Windows company anymore. That if they don't embrace a new way of doing business, they're not going to be relevant in 10 years, 15 years. And a key part of that transformation is embracing collaboration and open source. And he began with some simple things. If you look at what Satya Nadella did almost the first year in the job, one of the first things he did is he said, you know, we've got this crazy thing when an engineer in one part of Microsoft can't even see the code of somebody else in another part of Microsoft. So not only didn't they participate in a big way in any of these big open source projects, they acted in a closed, proprietary way within Microsoft. And that was the first thing that he changed. He then realized that this idea of being Windows first, Windows only was crazy in something like the cloud, like Microsoft Azure. And he went and made sure that Linux could be a first-class citizen. And as he looked at .NET and had to deal with this challenge of how do I make sure that people keep finding .NET relevant rather than these new ways of doing things like Node.js, he realized that open sourcing .NET was a step in the right direction. And so what we've seen is that if you are the CEO of a major corporation, of a major vendor, you need to think about open source and make it a key part of your strategy. Just yesterday, we had this man up on stage. And it was really interesting to hear John Donovan talk about this, because John Donovan is not a vendor. Yet what is the key to his innovation in his business? It is about leveraging open source. But I loved a couple things that he said. The first one was, do you remember him saying, secret sauce is like Tabasco. It should come in small containers. And he elaborated on that and talked about how open source has been about 5% of what they are running within AT&T. And the goal that he is setting for his entire organization is, can we get to 50%? Think about that for a second. You've got the leader of one of the largest vendors in the world saying, we need to find a way to innovate again. Moving down the path of open source. And you have John Donovan running one of the largest telcos saying open source in our network is critical. It seems pretty clear. It seems that open is the way of the future. So not only is there disruption happening in the networking industry, as John Ronis just said, but open is certainly taking over the world. Before I say very much more, I want to acknowledge something I expect is happening in all of your heads. It certainly did for me when I was listening to John, which is, okay, open source sounds awesome, it sounds perfect, but what about the second part of that equation? Yes, of course you can get lots of people excited in using it, you're giving it away for free. What about monetizing? You know, that thing that Bill Gates said at the beginning of the presentation still makes sense to me. How do we pay engineers? And so we have to recognize that this isn't a binary shift from proprietary or closed. And I have to say I have a board member, a very bright, wise man named Chris Wright, who works for Red Hat. And he likes to say, whenever we're making decisions in the board, he says, you know what, if it's not open, it's closed. And while I think that that is a very good rule to live by, at the same time we have to recognize that there are degrees of open, and that it is okay that there are degrees of open. I hear far too often in the press, with academics, and with others, people who seem to espouse the idea that vendors are inherently evil. In fact, within this idea of disruption, you hear people talking about anybody who's got an established business needs to go away. We need to disrupt them. There seems to be sometimes a cult of the startup. And I personally think that that's a little bit closed-minded, and I think that that misses something important. There's a reason that the incumbents are still there, and there is a lot of value that is still being added. And demagoguing vendors, I think, is a poor way for us to achieve what we really want, which fundamentally is this decoupling, is this opening up that avoids the vendor lock-in, but at the same time allows that pace of innovation to continue. And so we have to recognize that there are degrees of open and ask ourselves, why are there these degrees of open? You know, when I look at my members and my potential members in my community, one of the things that I do is I stop to think about the market position of each in our industry in networking. Because if you have no position, it is very easy to disrupt yourself. It is very easy to go completely open if you don't threaten a revenue stream. On the other hand, if you have a large revenue stream that's there, it's a lot harder to immediately open things up. There was a panel a little earlier where people were bemoaning the fact that a certain chip vendor had opened up an API but hadn't fully opened it up. They really only cracked open the door of open. But you know what? I thought to myself, if I was CEO of that company, I'd probably do the same thing. Because if they went too open too quickly, they could potentially wipe out all of their profits, get a huge hit from Wall Street, and become irrelevant. And so we have to recognize that every single senior executive at these major companies is doing a calculus, that every single startup is doing a calculus. How do I on one hand answer this need for open, and on the other hand preserve my ability to monetize, potentially preserve my existing revenue stream? And so rather than put people in blocks of these guys are evil, these guys are good, all openness is great, closedness is bad, I prefer instead to think about us all being united in a journey towards the open. And as part of that, we need to celebrate when people are doing things well, but at the same time, not give people too much credit. We have to understand this journey is difficult. And to this idea of open washing, there is absolutely there's an easy path if we let people get away with it. If you had a chance to get the benefit of something without doing the work, of course you would take it. And so here, one of my favorite pictures, natural Cheetos. I don't know about you, I don't know what's natural about putting your hand in a bag and it coming out orange. Yet we see natural Cheetos in our industry all the time. You get a little bit of openness, and you get a marketing department who jumps all over and go, look how open we are. Let's celebrate the fact that they're a little more open than they were and give credit there, but not let people get away with claiming that they're far more open than they are. We also have to understand that open source does not guarantee interoperability. It's a key helper to interoperability, but you don't get it out of the box. And so I wanted to leave you with one slide that is actually quite different from the last slides that I put up. This is my litmus test. If you in this room are an end user, I suggest that you put some version of these 10 questions in every RFI, every RFP, and every vendor presentation that you sit in. If you're a vendor, I would suggest that you read through them and think to yourself, do you meet these questions? 3 categories about how open is your product. Let's look at the product itself. Let's look at its ability to work with other products, interoperability, and finally, the behavior of the vendor. And sorry, it's a little bit of an eye chart. Let me go through all 10. The first one, if what you care about is openness and interoperability, lack of lock-in, as Chris Luke said, community is critical. And so is this product based on a vibrant open source project with a broad, engaged community? Does it have a mature governance model? There are too many cases where someone will throw up code on GitHub. Code on GitHub does not make a vibrant open source community. I personally struggle with cases in which one individual, one company open sources. Sorry, John, there are companies who could open source and keep all control. There is a concern there from a community side. So having looking at governance is actually quite important. Another piece is, if you're based on an open source project, are you taking just a little bit of it or all of it? Is it a fork? Is it modular or embedded? Those are really important questions. If it's a fork, it started out as open and may not be open today. If it's modular, that's the best. If it's embedded, that could be okay, but you've got to think about the implications. From an interoperability standard, you have to ask yourself, does it support all the major APIs and protocols? This is critical to the ability to interoperate with other solutions. From a vendor interoperability question, a critical question to ask is, will this vendor support other vendors' hardware? Potentially even other vendors' software solution. Really, the question you're asking yourself here is, could I replace this software with another software from the same open source project? Now, I'm not saying it's easy. There will always be work. It shouldn't necessarily be easy, but it shouldn't be impossible. And finally, and I think these are probably the most important question of all, looking at a vendor who has an open solution, ask, are they a significant contributor to the open source project? But also, where are they contributing? It is very easy to simply consume. It's not quite as easy, but not that far down the road, to simply be at the edge and contribute something that nobody else is leveraging. The people who really are strategically positioned in an open source project are contributing at the heart, at the core of that project, and that is critical, especially if you have a bug or a challenge. This means that they have an ability to bring a patch to drive that change that you need. Do they have an upstream first policy, or are they constantly forking? Kelly Harrell did a very good presentation on this earlier. And then finally, and this is the one I think that is asked way too infrequently, are they leading with the open source project, or is it a back pocket project for them? Not in this industry, but I have a friend who's a sales engineer for a company, and they came out with an open source product. In fact, they also had a proprietary product. And one of the SEs in the room during the SE training raised his hand while the CEO was presenting, and he asked him the question, when should we lead with the open source solution as opposed to the proprietary one? And the CEO said, oh no, never lead with it. Always lead with the proprietary. If the customer is ready to leave and go buy some other open solution, then you can pitch him our open solution. That has real implications for you. And so, as I said, these are the 10 critical questions. No vendor out there on any product is perfect on all of them. They may not all matter to you for everything that you're buying, but I think they're really good questions to ask your vendor to see, is this product truly open?
Wow, I thought that was, I hope you agree, it was a lot of insightful presentations, stimulating presentations, so really appreciate it. So I guess you guys should get ready to ask questions, and this is your session. I want you to engage in the conversation and so on. So please get ready. I mean, I can keep asking questions to these distinguished people, and so keep them busy, but I want you to participate as well. So Neila, I mean, I wanted to start with you. You gave a very nice talk about open source, but as you know, there are so many open source models. You know, I mean, open source, as much as it is now very hot, it has existed for a number of years, right? And so what I have struggled in the context of open source SDN in ONS is, what is the right model, or are there recipes for creating open source projects that we should be following? Simple thing like, yeah, we have to have community, we have to have transparency and all of that, those we understand. But nevertheless, still, how does one, what is your recipe for success?
Right. So I think the first thing we have to recognize is times change. And so, you know, the easy thing to do is, well, let's look at the most successful open source project. Let's look at Linux, and we're just going to copy that. That's a little bit akin to saying, if I wanted to start a computer company, you know, the recipe is easy. You get in a dorm, you don't get any venture capital, you get a soldering iron, you order these boards. I mean, that's how Steve Jobs did it, it's how Michael Dell did it. Clearly, that's how you start a company in 2015. Well, no, that's how you start a company 30 years ago. In the same way, I do think that there is some level of learning that we have. On the other hand, there are some things that have stayed exactly the same across the time. I think you hit on some key ones. Number one is this community element. So you have to start with a problem that needs to be solved. You have to start with a bunch of really smart engineers, and you have to have a model that attracts a whole set of people around. Just like startups, you talked about 3 startups, or 50 startups, you invest in 3 of them succeed. We see the same thing with open source. Often when you get one guy who has some brilliant idea and throws it on GitHub, most of those completely fail. So from what I see, I really see 3 kinds of projects that succeed out there. The first one is that 1 in 20,000, right? One smart guy gets it and suddenly a bunch of people show up. Tends to work better in tools than anything else. It's actually very risky, especially if it never gets bigger. We had the case with Heartbleed that we've had. A second model, and I think Docker is the perfect example right now, is you get a company that is facing that exact challenge that John was mentioning, which is, how do I get people to know and to start using what I'm doing? Yes, it may make monetization later harder, but how do I get the entire world excited? And it's a normal startup model with the exception that, hey, anybody can download it and use it. And then the big question that comes up there is, how quickly do you move towards a foundation? How long do you keep control? The longer you keep control, the quicker members of your community can start forking if they don't like what you're doing.
Okay, so I guess I want to...
Can I just say, and the third one, which we see more and more, is large companies from the beginning getting together rather than waiting 10, 15 years like IBM did with Linux and jumping in, actually coming together and say, we have a common interest, we're duplicating a whole set of efforts, a whole set of developers come together, bring users as soon as they can come together, and start working on a platform. Those really are the 3 major models we see. The last one is OpenStack's a great example. Eclipse would be another great example. Open Daylight would be a third.
So I guess, so maybe I want to follow up just, and then I want to follow up with another question. But we also know, if you look at the successful software systems that people are building, I mean, this morning we heard from Google, Facebook, and all of that, right? Small teams, focused teams have a more probability of success when large numbers of companies join wanting to create something. So how do you balance that? Because there is one aspect that says focus, a coherent team and all of that is good. And yes, you want users and communities, but those are people adding value on the edges as opposed to getting them to build the core.
So can I add to that?
Oh, please.
Yeah, so I have a solution to that, right? Mm-hmm. Don't let marketing people close to any of these standards or open source activities, okay? And the reason for that, I mean, I ran standards for so many years, right? And we've seen, you know, when good things were happening, 20 technical marketing engineers come in, and all of a sudden, you know, the room is talking on things that are relevant to one company and not others. So you know, there's, I mean, right now there is no screening process on any of this, right? But one thing I have seen in all the experience on the open sources, you know, or open standards, right, is the technical smart people, smart engineers, they don't work for a company. They work for the code. They work for solving the problem. So as long as we all align to that, good things will happen.
Okay. My general answer is if we look at what the trends of what's happening, more and more collaborative projects are what is succeeding. You know, I mean, if what it was take 5 people in a room, give them a problem, close the door, lock them in there, and wait 3 years. I mean, this is what we tried to do for 20 years, and it didn't work. There's a really interesting article in Fortune about Mark Hurd shutting down almost the entire HP innovation department. And you say, were those people not smart enough? Were they not motivated? Were they not working hard enough? They were. What we find is that if you put different people together with a governance structure that allows people to experiment but also work with each other, that is what has been working over and over again. You know, if we look at Hadoop project after project, it's not surprising that the innovation is coming from these large projects rather than small groups.
Again, Neila, maybe I want to move on to this, right? When you take the example of Hadoop, Hadoop did not happen by 20 companies starting it. Hadoop happened with a very small group of people inside Yahoo starting it and then getting certain traction, getting certain success, and then realizing that now it is ready for the community and then turning it into an open source project. That is my interpretation of the history of Hadoop.
Actually, Guru, it started at Google.
Sorry?
Larry and Sergey created it. I mean, it was a proprietary Hadoop was a complete hack. It was a copy of Bigtable and Google.
Yeah, right.
That innovation didn't happen in the open source collaborative spirit. It happened at a $190 billion company.
But regardless, I'd say that even the largest open source projects are really just an amalgam of much smaller projects with some kind of management hierarchy that helps steer those projects to build a single project and then integrate them together. Yep. That's what all happens at OpenStack, what happens at Open Daylight. I see it happening with a lot of the others that are new on the scene.
I think on OpenStack and ODL, if you don't mind, I think the jury is still out. I don't want to declare success on OpenStack. And sorry to say that on ONS or ODL, jury is still very much out. So if you want to take examples of successes, we had to go back a little bit more. I don't think I want to learn from OpenStack as yet.
So maybe the Linux project, which is a huge hierarchical project, so much so that how commits in Git get propagated back up to the kernel itself is this huge, long hierarchy that things have to run through. I would argue Linux is a successful project.
Yeah, but so if you study it, and I have, just because I've had to put money into this.
Money talks.
Linux is a unicorn. Do you know how many copies of Linux there are out there?
Gazillions.
Do you know how many copies of Hadoop?
Well, maybe
give me an order of magnitude.
Yeah.
Many orders of magnitude less. So you can build a multi-billion-dollar company selling only support in a market size like Linux, right? But there are a few others. They don't exist. So that's why you see open source companies, the successful ones, they don't have the completely open and collaborative model. They can't. Innovation comes when you have constraints. You need constrained resources. The communities don't innovate. They harden. They improve. They suggest. But the innovation, take any successful open source, again, the VC's perspective, so take that for what it's worth. JBoss, MySQL, DataStax now, Mongo, Docker, a company has to be behind it. There has to be a controlled way to manage the innovation. They can benefit from the community. In the end, it's critical.
Exactly.
But I don't think OpenStack or OpenFlow worked in the way that it could have if there had been a company behind either.
Yes, I think I am on the same page as John, and that's why I'm trying to understand what models work. But anyway, I think we should probably move on from that topic, right? So tell me, guys, please step up, otherwise I can keep having this conversation. Dan, I want to kind of focus on what ONF is wanting to do. So as we said with Atrium, right, great start, right? What is ONF's plans to kind of build community supported? Because even if you do a distribution, right? So for example, if I take an example of Ubuntu as a distribution of Linux, it's a phenomenal amount of work and people and engineers and so on to create a distribution out of some open source projects and then be able to sustain it. So what is ONF thinking about supporting a distribution?
Well, that's a good question because we've had so much interest. Saurabh came to me today and said, oh my God, so many people want to do stuff, and what do I do? And that's where we're going to gain some useful experience in building a community that can help provide that. You need some structure, you need some leadership, you need some governance, and you need to find easy ways for people's effort to be channeled into something useful and constructive. So, our plan is find out who is willing, who is not just interested, but willing to contribute in a way that actually helps do that. When you talk about contributing to an open source project, yes, code is the coin of the realm, and that's the most critical way of contributing, but there are other ways of contributing. If you look at all the projects and who is actually doing what, there are some different roles. And we don't have, we have a tiny staff. And a lot of the work that resulted in Atrium came from one person, the one developer that we have, but a lot of it also came from the partners that contributed to it. And as we go to expanding what applications will be on it, what facilities, what kind of systems will attach to it, we're going to be looking for people that can sort of help manage the growth of the project as well as contributing some particular piece of code.
But am I hearing it right that you're still your plan is to depend on other people to contribute resources and primarily, and then that is how you plan to maintain it, or given all the interest that you're hearing, that ONF will want to put some resources behind it itself?
Well, it's a combination of the two. And we'll have to see how concrete the interest is and whether it's coming from the vendor side or the operator side, and really where they want to contribute, what we have to work with, and then what we have to augment ourselves.
Okay. But you will need to figure this out more quickly because this industry is moving quite quickly, right? So, okay.
Yeah, this is a major focus of our efforts this summer and this fall.
Okay. You guys have any questions, comments to make for each other's presentation?
I'd like to sort of raise a question here for everyone who has experience, which is the people aspect of open source. And I'd like your experience here. From what I understand, which is sort of secondhand, there are different cultures in different open source projects, and some of them are notoriously hostile to contributors, and some are notoriously hostile to only certain kinds of contributors. And I was wondering if you have sort of any advice to people here who are excited about the concept of how they can contribute and learn sort of the ropes of being appreciated and also being effective.
Well, the first rule that most people say about open source projects is join the mailing list, read it, and don't write anything for a month. Just to get the temperature of what that community is like. And you'll quickly learn how hostile it is to new entrants that haven't read the FAQ. So if there is one, go read it. But in general, the idea is that when other people contribute code, you learn from their experience how the community accepts that. And I agree, there are certainly some communities out there that are very hostile if you don't speak the right lingo. In some cases, this has been the difference between people who are focused on software and networking people coming in, invading their space and saying, we think it should be this way. And it doesn't jive with what they already know. But it goes the other way too.
I also think that you have to be careful where we get our info and our news from, which is, I don't know too many reporters who are going to write a headline that says, developer spends 2 hours holding hand of other developer, telling him how good a job he's doing. Right? You get the one article where the guy loses his cool, and I don't know about you, I'm certainly not perfect, and I've lost my cool plenty of times in my life, and I'm really glad there wasn't a camera, there wasn't a mailing list that archived every comment I've ever made for the world. Open source, in my experience, is full of human beings, and often they're not in front of each other, they're communicating through the internet, and so you get a range of behaviors. What I hear over and over again is that people who are in open source love being in open source, and it's a great community. And in fact, you see more often than not, people going from one employer to the other and staying in the project. There's someone who I spoke to today who ended up leaving his current employer, and he went to a startup, and I said, oh, I was really sorry to lose you in the community. He said, oh, you're not losing me in the community. I've gone quiet. I'm going to be a consumer because it's a smaller company. I'm going to consume Open Daylight as part of my product, but I'll give back eventually. And so I actually think, yes, you get a lot of press around Linus Torvalds' few comments where he says, no, absolutely not. I want to keep the kernel tight, get this, take this garbage away from me. But for the most part, the experience of people who've contributed to Linux, and I'd say most open source project, is actually very positive. I will say one thing. Open source projects are notoriously male-dominated. I think there are a bunch of reasons for that, and we do have to improve there.
I think there's also another aspect of people dynamics that we have not talked about. So the one is the open source community. I won't repeat that. But the other one is the roles that admins play in the customer that we serve, right? Whether it's a carrier or the enterprise, the sysadmin, the network admin, the storage admin, right? And what is happening is with the lines blurring and moving to a compute-centric environment, right? The Linux, the chefs, the puppets, right? The opening of switches to be managed like a server resonates extremely well with a server admin, right? Who has done this for a living. And the network admin's like, where's my CLI? I'm like, it doesn't exist, right? In this new world. So what we have to do is, along with the open source community, I think there is another people dynamics of, how do admins, the sysadmins and the network admins, storage admins, right? How do we bring them together? This is just in the enterprise. And then if you talk about carriers, you make it, 4 times worse, because there's the IT side and then there is the CTO or the network side, right, where you have the triple play admins, right, the voice, video, data, right, et cetera. And bringing that organization and people dynamics together is the challenge we as vendors face, right, from a people dynamics, along with the open source. So, we're kind of stuck in the middle on both sides, right? And it's a people issue that we need to break through in the next year or two.
Okay. So John, I have a follow-up question for you. So you made a very compelling case about networking being hot and open source being hot and all of that. Still, so can you elaborate a little bit more that if somebody walks in into your firm and wants to pitch a startup idea for an open source based project, what are you looking for?
For an open source based project?
Yeah, open source based, somebody comes to you and pitches a business plan. What are you looking for? So,
almost without fail, you need to have the creator of the project.
Sorry?
The creator.
Okay.
The Linus, the Jonathan Ellis, the Monty, because without that creator, you lack credibility. And so ultimately, you're going to shepherd a community, and it's very difficult when projects come in and they don't have that founding kind of visionary. That's the artist I was talking about. So that's number one. Number two, it's the market opportunity and timing. Usually demonstrated in part by the initial traction, and we measure that in downloads, conference attendance, commits, activity on the IRCs. We kind of look to see what's the pulse of this thing, and then last is kind of an alignment around this business sort of, vision, view. My view is that there's only so many operating system size markets, for example. And so having a completely open, support-only business and a religion about that, in my opinion, doesn't work. And so the best open source companies, I believe, have all the benefits of open source in terms of that community and adoption and momentum, but they usually find a way to have a business model, a monetization model that goes beyond just pure support. Because support actually scales with people. And those are hard businesses, right? Your revenue grows, so does your operating expense. People want businesses where the top line grows and the bottom line grows less fast. And so the best businesses in open source, typically, they're able to carve out some component of the solution that the community actually doesn't mind having proprietary. And often we see that in monitoring, management of the solution, security functionality, role-based access. That's not stuff a community wants to build in open source. It can be very powerful as the enterprise distribution of said project. So it's the three things. It's kind of the credibility in the creator, the momentum around in the market and timing, and sort of an alignment around what do you want to be when you grow up.
Terrific. I think very crisp answers. Okay. I guess we have questions. I want to make sure we take that.
Yep. So just to get a prediction going forward out of the open source discussion. So if we come back to this conference next year and we talk about open source, are we going to see 10 existing companies have figured out how to use existing open source products and do something interesting? Are we going to see 10 new startups come out of those open source because it's easier for them than existing companies? Or are we going to see 10 new open source communities bloom to create new virtualized network functions or whatever? So what's sort of the success in terms of the next step next year?
Neila, you want to start?
Sure. I would start to say we're seeing a lot of it, and John Donovan stands up and is the first major company to stand up and say, I'm going from 5 to 50%, and an open source project, Open Daylight, is at the heart of my SDN strategy. I think next year and the year later, you're going to see more and more big companies come up and talk not just of what they're planning to do, but what they've already done. You're going to see more and more startups, more and more existing companies that have chosen to, rather than build on proprietary, actually build on top of open source. So we're at about 20 that are built on Open Daylight. I predict that by next year, we'll probably be on 40 or 50 of them.
So I think my view is typically what happens is companies, when the disruption, as I was talking about, the technology adoption, right? When we get to the ramp and then the mass market, right? And then there's multiple different ways to do things. Companies tend to stick to what they're good at, right? So you move back to your core competency, right? And so if you look at that, then companies that enable the best of the hardware infrastructure, right? Because they have the supply chain, they have the models, they have the businesses, they have those, demand.
You mean like Dell?
Thank you. I'm getting up the stack. I started at the bottom, right? I mean, I can go from the top. But, you move to that, and those companies will enable, if they have to. I mean, if we are sitting here and we're saying, I will build the best vertically integrated stack next year, it's not going to work. And if all of my 5 peer vendors, right? By the way, there's just 5 of us left at the end of the day, right? So there's not like 20 companies as shown in John's chart. Things have changed. So if all of them, minus 1 or 2, stay and get to open, right? You got the first layer up. On top of that, you have the controller and the 4 layers I was talking about, right? As you get to that, and as you get more consolidation, right? You start getting to the mass adoption, right? It's just imminent, right? It's going to happen, and we are at a point. You can equate it to the bubble, you can equate it to technology adoption. Doesn't matter. You're at a point where there's 20 things that pop up, then you have consolidation. The guys who enable 20 of them will succeed, okay? And they will move to their core competency versus doing everything themselves, okay? Because none of us are smart enough to do everything ourselves.
Okay. Anyone else wants to respond to that question?
I'm only a very brief comment. Open source is a lot like evolution and natural selection. Eventually, the successful projects are the ones that succeed.
Yeah.
But I think I would say that
Darwin.
yes, I think next year I can say with pretty high confidence that you will see more end customers using and making their solution, deploying open source based. There will be more existing people building solutions based on open source. Hopefully there will be more startups building on open source. I think all of those things will be more true next year than what we have today, because we are on this trajectory, and it seems to me that this is not stopping anytime soon. Actually, it's gaining more and more momentum rather than otherwise.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, Guru, is I think what won't happen are the incumbents, the proprietary closed incumbents, moving quickly to embrace open source. And while I appreciate John Donovan's comment, I bet that 5% is 6 next year, not 46. I don't think they're going to move at the speed that they anticipate. I think that will come from startups. And what I would add that I hope happens is you're seeing a lot of innovation at the web scale companies, and Chris, like yours, where you guys are really pushing the envelope. I would love to see those companies, the Googles, the Apples, the Facebooks, can they really take what they're learning and contribute that to those, because that will drive it forward. There's a credibility that comes. The same way we saw Hadoop come, in some ways, the concept out of Google. You're seeing it in these web scale companies. They're really innovative. They've got to get on the open source train and really help drive the projects forward.
Totally. I said it in my presentation very much, that any community for open source needs to have its users represented. Without it, it cannot succeed. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I guess maybe your question, and then we'll go to the closing comments from this. Okay, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Olga, co-founder of Olga Media. I would like to say thank you that we have Open Networking Summit, and for big companies, big corporations supporting open source. I also would like to say thank you for our engineers and everyone who support open source, because if not that, we would not be able to open companies around the globe for a fraction of cost was 30 years ago, even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, because right now you can have data centers, affordable storages and networking for fraction, really, cost. And that's actually help to create more talent and businesses, which benefits everyone. So I would like to say thank you to everyone for that.
Okay, terrific. Okay, so I think opportunity to make closing comments. So Dan, you want to start?
So I just want to challenge everyone in the room. Sometime before your next birthday, it's tough for me because mine's tomorrow.
Oh, happy
Seriously?
birthday, Dan.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Think about something you can do to contribute to some open source project somewhere.
Damn, you stole my line.
Good idea.
No, I was going to say, I would hope that certainly by, maybe not birthday, I was going to say by the next time we all get together, everybody has tried to contribute to some project that they use in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't even have to be a networking project. Open source communities are wide and varied, and they thrive on people having input. So I guess I'll just reiterate the last line of my slide. Keep calm, contribute code.
Neila?
Sure. We've talked a lot about open source, but I think what's really magical, what we're seeing, is actually collaborative models. When we talk about open, it's not just about open source, it's about being open as individuals. What I challenge all of you to do is not only go write a line of open source code, that's great, but think about how you can be more open personally in your life, how you can collaborate more and better within your organization, be more collaborative across lines, whether you're a startup or a large company. How can you take the underlying ethos of what we've seen in open source companies to make whatever you're doing better?
John?
It's really compelling. You're really good at that. You feel inspired. All I'd say is that, Guru, you've been very generous, and I've been participating in this since the beginning. And every year it amazes me how much momentum and activity and how bright so many of the people here are. And so thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you.
All right, so I have two closing comments. So the first one is clearly, as I showed, the disaggregation of servers happened, okay? The proprietary mainframes are gone, right? A few apps are remaining. Exactly the same thing is going to happen to networking, and it's already on the way, okay? Dell will be, upfront doing this along with the ecosystem and the partners. So that's my first closing comment. And then the next one, I want to sort of do the following, which is, thank Guru for an amazing conference with the speakers and the content. I mean, well, let's just give a big round of applause.
Thank you.
It has been one of the most, intriguing, thought-provoking, non-fluff conference. Let's put it this way. I mean, to be very honest, this was a business panel with some technical, just because it was the last one. Other than that, I mean, it's been really, really great. So thank you very much for leading this.
Oh, thank you so much. Really appreciate. And so I want to thank the panelists again. They stood around, a lot of stimulating and insightful comment. So let's thank them one more time. And I do want to take a minute to, this is the end of the Open Networking Summit 2015. So I want to thank you all, the audience, and your participation, especially you guys sticking around until the end. And I do want to identify again the two people who actually make ONS happen, Sadef Oskana and VB. So as somebody pointed out, that ONS is really made up of just those two full-time people. I mean, they are the people that make it happen. And so it's a very efficient, effective event organization that we have, and that is because those two people work very, very hard. Is Ram around as well? So Ram Appalaraju is another person this year. He helped organizing ONS. I wanted to thank him as well. So again, thank you all. It has been a lot of fun, and hope to see you again next year. Okay.